Okay, we're doing a sound test right now. So I hope Nathan can hear and give me a kind of a verification that it's all working well. I hope the sound is high enough. Looks like the microphone is on. So what?
Sound goes down when you turn your headphones.
Well, I got the laptop back a little farther, so maybe it'll be. Yes, Nathan.
Hey.
So
go ahead and give it a test.
Yeah, is it working? See if you can check the audio for me. I think the video is probably okay. Let's just check the audio.
All right. Let's see right there. All right, you just a second. All right, go ahead.
Okay, this is a test. Can you hear me okay? I'm trying to just see if Nathan can pick up so we know we got the microphone set up right. Is that coming through okay?
Actually, I'm having a difficulty on my end. Hold on one second.
Okay, I've got little green dots here, but there's not that many of them, so it's not. Maybe I need to get like.
It looks okay. It's not like.
Okay, testing 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Can you hear that? Okay. Is that coming through?
Yeah, that sounds really good.
Okay, all right. Well, I moved a little closer, so we'll be all right. So we got 5 minutes yet before we start, so we're in good shape. So give me a call or a text if something goes wrong.
You got it.
All right, thanks, Nathan. Jesse, you see if Jesse wants to.
Hello.
Hello, Jesse.
Yes.
Do you need me to call you tonight for Bible study?
No, I've got Marilyn on the phone right now.
Okay, all right. Just wanted to check.
Thanks, Dad.
We got 3 minutes. All right, take care. Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Okay, Marilyn's hooking him up. So.
Yeah, but blue house, they just.
I've got about a minute and a half. Okay, it's 7. Well, good evening, everyone. It's 7 o'clock, time to begin our Bible study for this week. This is middle of November, and we're getting into the rainy season. I think it's rained about a week solid so far, so everything's pretty wet. But if you bow your heads, we'll ask the blessing, and then we'll begin the study for this evening. Our eternal great God, we're very thankful that we have your word. We're very thankful it is light to our feet, lamp to our path, and we're just thankful that we are able to study it. We have individual copies. We have many study tools. We know that many of the generations previous to ours did not. We just thank you so much for that. We thank you we're able to connect through electronic means, and just ask you to help us to get back together in a meeting and regular services as soon as possible, as we know it is your will. And we just thank you now for this evening. We ask you to be with those that are sick and heal those that are in the hospital and need your help. And we ask it in Jesus Christ's name. Amen. Okay, well, last time we started a series on the kings of Israel, not just from an historical perspective, per se. It's not kind of a get the facts type study of their history, although there is obviously much of that. But we want to look at their personalities and perhaps try to see some of their own emotions that are expressed and some of the challenges that they faced, how they faced them, whether it was successful or not successful. Tonight, we are going to start with King David. We had 2 studies on King Saul. King David is a huge challenge because there is more on him in the Bible than any other king. In fact, there's almost more on him than any other person except for Jesus Christ. The name David is mentioned 1,141 times in the Bible, and he is the only person named David in the scriptures. There are no others. There are a number of names in the Bible that you know, Joshua, others that have Peter, have many, Simon, have quite a number of people mentioned that have that name. Mary perhaps is the most confusing name in the New Testament because it's difficult to know which Mary is which in quite a number of the gospel accounts. But David, it is not a problem. When the name David comes up, we know who that is. What I want to do on the study this evening is to try to look at some of the aspects of David's character, personality, and as exemplified in his life about why he is selected to be the king during the millennium. Quite a tremendous honor. Obviously, one of the highest honors in history for anyone. I want to begin in Ezekiel chapter 37 and verse 22. Actually, I'll start about verse 20. This is just, we want to start by saying and acknowledging that God has chosen David to be the king during the millennium. And there is no question about that. In fact, there are multiple scriptures that verify that truth. First, in Ezekiel chapter 37, Ezekiel has two sticks. One represents Israel, one represents Judah. Verse 20 says, "The sticks on which you write will be in your hand before their eyes. Then say to them, thus says the Lord God, surely I will take the children of Israel from among the nations wherever they have gone, and will gather them from every side and bring them into their own land." So God is promising that these two sticks, Israel and Judah, they'll be reunited and they'll be brought back into the land where God gave them. Verse 22, "I will make them one nation in the land on the mountains of Israel, and one king shall be king over them," one king. "And there'll no longer be two nations, nor shall they ever be divided into two kingdoms again." So one kingdom, one nation made up of all 12 tribes of Israel. 13 if you want to consider Ephraim and Manasseh as being equal tribes. "They shall not defile themselves anymore with their idols, nor with their detestable things." So the horrible idolatry that we see around us today and has gone on down through the centuries, that will be a thing of the past. It says no more detestable things. So no more things like transgenderism, all of the perversions that are extolled and supported in our government, our life today. No more abortion, no more murder of innocent babies. So all the detestable things about modern Israeli life are going to be a thing of the past. "Nor with any of their transgressions, but I will deliver them from all their dwelling places in which they have sinned, and will cleanse them. And they shall be my people, and I will be their God." So the purpose of this, of course, is that they will finally be God's people. "David, my servant, shall be king over them, and they shall all have one shepherd." So David is going to be king over all of them, and he shall be a shepherd. Interesting that his first 17 years he spent basically as a shepherd. It says, "They shall also walk in my judgments and observe my statutes and do them. And they shall dwell in the land that I have given to Jacob my servant, where your fathers dwelt, and they shall dwell there, they and their children, and their children's children," so for generation after generation. "Moreover, my servant David shall be their prince forever." Now, this is a little bit of a challenge here because David is called king and then he's called prince. And then later in Ezekiel, when we have the description of the millennial temple, there's a gate and there's walkways that are reserved for the prince. And there is I just say a controversy sometimes in discussion about whether or not this prince is Jesus Christ having returned to the earth, or is it King David, the prince that will use these special gates and walkways in Jerusalem. The honest answer is we don't know. God doesn't tell us the name of the prince, the identity of him. We'll just have to wait and let God work that out and reveal that in his own time. Verse 26, "Moreover, I will make a covenant of peace with them, and it shall be an everlasting covenant with them. I will establish them and multiply them, and I will set my sanctuary in their midst forevermore." So God's sanctuary, the rebuilt temple, but sanctuary really signifies the presence of God, which would also be the new Jerusalem coming down after all the earth. The physical earth is no more of a need for God. "The tabernacle of God shall be with them." Verse 27, "My tabernacle also shall be with them." Remember in Revelation 21, New Jerusalem comes down and we see the tabernacle of God, and he will dwell or tabernacle with them for all time. It says, "The nations will also know that I, the Lord, sanctify or set apart Israel when my sanctuary is in their midst forever." It's a great truth that has been lost on the people of the earth and sadly on the people of Israel, the ones who have been sanctified and set apart for a special purpose, which was to be an ensign or an example nation to all the other nations of the earth. The other nations would say, what nation has such wonderful laws and has a God that protects them and provides for them like that? Sadly, Israel has turned away from that. In our modern times, we have adopted idolatry and evil in every way. So we do have a challenge, obviously, but everybody will know, all the nations will know that God sanctified Israel and why, and they will then follow that example. Now, I want to do a little bit of background before we get into. I'm going to do a little study tonight on some of the, let's just say, the personality traits and the emotions of King David. I think all of you are very familiar with the general trend of his life story. So we don't need to go through all of those, although we will cover some, obviously. The first thing I think we need to understand, not only is there only one person in the Bible named David, but the name David actually comes from the same root word meaning to love or to have love. So God is love. The name of David comes from a root meaning to love. It's kind of like the verb to love, and in a slightly modified form that mean David would be loved one or loved, beloved by God. So, God is love, 1 John chapter 4, verse 8 and 16. So God is love, and David, who is going to be ruling over the tribes of Israel in millennium, his name actually means love or to be loved or one who is loved. Now, his genealogy is given to us actually several times. It's appended to the book of Ruth because Ruth was an ancestor. Now, that's an interesting sidelight we will talk about later, that Ruth was a Moabitess, and Ruth had connections going back to Moab. So when King Saul was trying to kill David, where did David take his parents for protection? Took him back to Moab. So there's a connection here beyond just Ruth. There's probably a later connection too that we'll see through his mother. But so for right now, let's just go on with that. So here we have David belonged to the tribe of Judah. We know that. His ancestor Nahshon, Nahshon, was chieftain of the tribe. I want to go to 1 Chronicles chapter 2 and verse 4. 1 Chronicles chapter 2 and verse 4. As you know, Ezra wrote Chronicles, and he kind of did it as a history of the lineage of the people of Israel. And so these names are very important, and they tell us something. And they tell us a lot of who begat who, and who begat who, and who was the father of who. But it's all very important in God's eyes, even though today we sometimes discount the importance of the lineage of Israel. But 1 Chronicles chapter 2 and verse 4 says, Tamar, his daughter-in-law, bore Perez and Zerah. Remember that Judah had this bad relationship, illicit relationship with Tamar, who was his daughter-in-law, who was supposed to have been given to a new husband. And she had two sons, Perez and Zerah, and that line separated. And one line essentially migrated up to Ireland, and the other line stayed and became leading descendants of Judah and became the ancestors of King David. So let's continue here. All the sons of Judah were 5. The sons of Perez were Hezron and Halmul. The sons of Zerah were Zimri, Ethan, Heman, Calcol, and Dara, 5 of them in all. The son of Carmi was Achar, the troubler of Israel, who transgressed, Carmi in the accursed thing. Now let's continue on down a little bit farther. We don't have to read all of these, but let's go down to verse 11. Nahshon begat Salma, and Salma begat Boaz. So Nahshon was an ancestor here of Boaz, and then Boaz begot Obed. Obed begot Jesse. Now, there are a few people missing because this is also grandparents and great-grandparents, and they're showing who was the lineage. This is kind of a study in what's called primogeniture, which means the oldest son, the son that inherits the birthright. The inheritance laws of England, and actually a lot of Europe for many years, but even today in England, the inheritance laws of primogeniture still apply, that the entire estate goes to the oldest son, the primogeniture, the first one born. Primo instead of prima, so firstborn son. And what that does is it keeps the estates together rather than having all these royalties that have royal people that have all these farms and estates. If it were equal geniture, or there's actually a name for that in Latin, I forget what it is, where they're all given equally, those estates all get broken up, and eventually the king doesn't have a place to recruit soldiers. That was the original reason for it, was because those estates provided the medieval kings with their soldiers and their armies. But at any rate, this is kind of a study in firstborn son who inherits the birthright, because that's what we're heading at. We're heading for the birthright of the kingship of Judah, or the throne that's in Judah. So Obed begat Jesse. Jesse begat Eliab, his firstborn, Abinadab the second, Shimei the third. The fourth was Radai, the fifth, Ozem the sixth. David was the seventh. So David has here the lineage shown that he was the seventh, not the firstborn. Their sisters were Zuriah and Abigail. And the sons of Zeruiah were Abishai, Joab, and Ahasiel, 3. Now, these men are mentioned later as being in David's army. So they were his nephews, and they served in his army and were considered some of the mighty men or strong men of ancient Israel. So here we have some of the ancestry down to David, and it does include Nahshon. Nahshon, by the way, happened to be the brother-in-law of Aaron. So by marriage, David's lineage would go back and converge with Moses and Aaron, and that's Exodus chapter 6 and verse 23, if you want to look at that. So of the wives of Jesse, we know nothing. So of David's mother, we know 0. Consequently, without information about her, we could only make conjectures that possibly she was from Moab or had grandparents from Moab, just like Ruth did, as one possible reason that David would have taken his parents back there for protection. Now, I want to get into some things on David's personality, his personal character, but first I want to give you kind of some facts about David. He was the youngest of Jesse's 8 sons. He was the keeper of the sheep. Apparently, Jesse had a large farm, which would have been wheat. It would have grown barley. They may have had cows, but as one part of the farm operation, they would have had sheep, and David was the keeper of the sheep. He was ruddy or good-looking. The Hebrew word for ruddy actually means reddish, which means either had red or light or blonde hair. And the Hebrew word Adam or flesh meant perhaps reddish cheeks. Who knows what that means, but just ruddy or red. No doubt he had red, rosy cheeks, is what most of the commentaries say, and golden or auburn hair. He was of a beautiful countenance. The Hebrew word Yafet means he was pleasant, fair, or goodly to look at. So he was attractive. I guess he would have been, in the category of a model or movie star today. Who knows? But anyway, there are several places that mention that. We'll look at a couple of those a little bit later. Also says he was pleasant to look at. Different versions express these traits differently, but one of them, the Peshitta, says ruddy with beautiful eyes and very handsome. So no doubt he was one that people would look at and say he was very, very good looking. So those interesting facts about David is that basically he was blessed with good looks, but they're much more about his personality that makes him more qualified to be the ruler over all of Israel than just his good looks. Now, the personal character of David, and I want to pause for a second to say that you will get a much different impression of David reading 1st and 2nd Samuel than you will reading 1st Chronicles. Now, the reason is because Chronicles was written much later. It is a legal document approach to the book, whereas Samuel's book, or the book 1st and 2nd Samuel, are more of an story of each person. It's a personal story type approach, whereas Chronicles is more giving the legal document background as to why the people of Israel have gotten from God the legal title to the promised land and why they should have their own nation, and of course verifying the veracity of the king of Judah and the throne of Israel. So David gets a shorter amount of space in Chronicles. He also gets, I wouldn't call the word whitewashed, but his sins are glossed over. They're acknowledged, but they are not given to us in detail as they're given in the books of Samuel. So we have the accounts in Chronicles, and also we have the accounts in 1st and 2nd Samuel. Chronicles gives us more about how David organized the temple with the singers and the song, guys that played the instruments, the musicians and the songwriters. So Ezra's focus is on the temple and on the lineage to the throne, whereas in Samuel we have more about just the stories about those people's lives. So when you read the two together, they do talk about the same person, and they are in sync as far as the events and their chronology goes. But the important thing to remember is that Chronicles is a slightly different approach, and so don't expect the books to be exactly the same in talking about David. Now, we could spend a year discussing David's writings in the book of Psalms. Now, we're not going to do that. The book of Hebrews, chapter 4 and verse 7, simply refers to the book of Psalms as David said or David wrote. So we have the Hebrews writer, very likely the Apostle Paul, who simply said it is written in David, and then he quotes a lot of Psalms. Of course, the first chapter of Hebrews is simply 5 different Psalms that are given as prophetic proof about Jesus Christ. So, but the thing about the Psalms is they do give a vast, just kind of from one end of the spectrum to the other, a vast study of emotions, of experiences. There are 2 Psalms that are essentially the core of David's writing in the Psalms. And we're going to be able to read some of that. First, we probably could start over in Psalm 18. And Psalm 18 is it actually is in the Bible twice. It is also in 2 Samuel, but it is honestly the kind of the summary of David's, you might say, written feelings or experience that he went through with God. The Greek Bible attributes 73, the Hebrew Bible attributes 73 of the Psalms as having been written by David. Now, when you're reading the Psalms, you will find 13 of them that say a Psalm of David. And whether or not that was in the original, that David wrote it or somebody else wrote it in there, we don't know. But it certainly does give us at least 13 of the Psalms where it says this is a Psalm of David. And there's one Psalm, I think 72, at the end of it, it says the Psalms of David are ended. In other words, he wrote a whole bunch of them, and this was the last one he wrote before he died. In Psalm 18, this is you might say a summary of much of David's Psalms. Some of the Psalms are miktams or prayers of David. This one is to the chief musician, a Psalm of David, the servant of the Lord, who spoke the Lord the words on the song on the day that the Lord delivered him from the hand of all his enemies and from the hand of Saul. So this is when he was delivered from Saul, probably when the last time when David crossed the valley and he'd taken the cruse of water and the sword and said, look what I stole and I didn't hurt you. And I'm assuming that this is when this was written, because Saul then said, I'm not going to hurt you anymore. I'm not going to persecute you anymore. God is obviously with you. And he even called him my son. So chapter 18, this chapter 18 of or Psalm 18 is kind of a summary of how David felt and wrote down for us in the Psalms about God. Said, I will love you, O Lord, my strength. Now, keep in mind that his name means love or to be loved or beloved. So it's often interesting how often the word love comes out in his writings. I will love you, O Lord, my strength. The Lord is my rock, my fortress, and my deliverer. Now, we are not yet in the throes of the Great Tribulation. We are in the beginning stages of some very serious events in the decline of the greatest country in the history of the world. The decline of empires is never slow. It happens like the falling off of a cliff. Sometimes it may take a few decades, but oftentimes it happens very, very quickly if you studied the 25 or 27 or so empires in history. So here we have a time in which we live when things could drastically change tomorrow morning. Things could stay the way they sort of are, for who knows how long. It's really in God's hand, not ours. But the lesson that we must learn is that God is our rock and our fortress and our deliverer. He says, my God, my strength, in whom I will trust. I saw an article this morning on the news that there are now about 430 million firearms owned by Americans, which is about 1.3 or whatever per American. If they trust in their guns or in their bullets, they're going to be sadly mistaken. If we trust in God, we will never be mistaken if our trust is genuine and our faith is solid. So, and God is our strength in whom we trust, our shield, my shield and the horn of my salvation, my stronghold. Now, the horn of my salvation basically means strength. The word horn means strength. So the strength of my salvation. God, we trust in God. He is our strength. Verse 3, I will call upon the Lord who is worthy to be praised, so I shall be saved from my enemies. Now, some of David's written experiences for us are about his own feelings and what he went through, but they always come back to God's majesty and his credit for all the great things that have happened that God has done, and the credit for his deliverance from God or goes to God. He says, the pangs of death surrounded me, and that was true. He felt he was dying when he was persecuted for 13 years. This is very likely written after 13 years of running from Saul. 13 years of, as we mentioned last time, 21 different attempts on David's life by King Saul. And so this is all finished now, 13 years of running and being in danger and being living hand to mouth, living in caves, living in as a guest in other cities. No doubt it would have been the pangs of death or something along that feeling. The floods of ungodliness made me afraid. The sorrows of the grave, Sheol, surrounded me. The snares of death confronted me. In my distress, I called upon the Lord and cried out to my God. He heard my voice from his temple. Now, his temple wasn't built yet. They still had this, by that time, a very old tabernacle building, around 500 years old. And it would have been falling down, to say the least. It would have been in pretty tough shape. It would have been rotted. They must have had to rebuild parts of it and get more skins and stitch them on, and who knows what they did. But there was no temple. So he's calling out here about God's spiritual temple. He knows that God's presence is in heaven, in the third heaven, God's temple. And he says, from my voice, he heard from his temple. My cry came before him, even to his ears. Then the earth shook and trembled. The foundations of the hills also quaked and were shaken because he was angry. So he just said that God was angry at the way David was being persecuted and treated. Smoke went up from his nostrils. Now, David didn't see that. This is allegorical description of anger. This is allegorical descriptions of what God did. This is not literal. So keep in mind that it wasn't, maybe there was clouds in the sky moving that David saw. He may have thought that's something like, smoke that God would perhaps make. A devouring fire from his mouth. That could have been. God has sent fire in the form of lightning or just fire a number of times. Did it during Elijah's time. He did it during when they were making fun of Elijah and calling him a bald-headed man or something. At any rate, we have God here delivering David. Let's drop down a little bit far. Verse 13. The Lord thundered from heaven. The Most High entered his voice, hailstones and coals of fire. He sent out his arrows and scattered the foe. And, of course, then rebuked them. So, again, arrows would have been not literal, but would have been an allegorical description. Verse 17, he delivered me from my strong enemy, from those who hated me, for they were true strong for me. Now, there were those around King Saul that truly hated David and truly wanted him dead, men like Doeg the Edomite and some others. Verse 20, the Lord rewarded me according to my righteousness, according to the cleanness of my hands. He has recompensed me, for I have kept the ways of the Lord and have not wickedly departed from my God. So he acknowledged that he had been trying to obey God during this entire time. Verse 25, this is an important verse. With the merciful, you will show yourself merciful. King David, when he became king, had you might say, a pretty good track record of forgiving sins against him, for overlooking things, overlooking affronts. Several times he was betrayed. And he allowed people to get away with what should have been a death penalty offense. But he's very, just important here to understand, with the merciful, you will show yourself merciful. So David understood this about God's character, and he tried to become a merciful man himself. Not to the point of folly, not foolishness, but mercy, and that's a lot different. With a blameless man, you will show yourself blameless. With the pure, you will show yourself pure. And with the devious, you will show yourself shrewd. So nobody can outthink God. They can't outplot or plan him. He will certainly stop them no matter what when they're plotting evil. You will save the humble people, bring down their haughty looks. For you will light my lamp. The Lord my God will enlighten my darkness. For by you I can run against a troop. By my God I can leap over a wall. As for God, his way is perfect. The word of the Lord is proven. He is a shield to all who trust him. So in this part of the psalm, he's transferring to kind of telling others about God, like he promised in Psalm 51 later. He talked about a little bit farther that God gives him his strength. Verse 35, you've also given me the shield of your salvation. You've enlarged my path. There's the important thing that I want to point out here is this, verse 43. Verse 43 to 44 and 45 show that David somehow knew that he would be used to bring Gentiles to God. That what didn't happen during his time, it would only be fulfilled during the time of the millennium, apparently, when he is the prince or the king in Jerusalem. Verse 43, you have delivered me from the strivings of the people. So all these wars and battles between people, he's been delivered. You have made me the head of the nations. Well, God promised him that. It didn't happen during David's lifetime, but it will during the time we read about in Ezekiel 37. A people I have not known shall serve me, meaning Gentiles, people who were not Israelites, because David was the king over all Israel, as one nation, but a people who he didn't know would now serve him. As soon as they hear of me, they obey me. The foreigners submit to me. That's going to happen. It hasn't happened yet. It's going to happen in the future. The foreigners fade away and come frightened from their hideouts. The Lord lives. Blessed be my rock. Let the God of my salvation be exalted. It is God who avenges me. Notice, and subdues the peoples under me. So that will happen again in the future. Verse 50, the last verse, great deliverance he gives to his king and shows mercy to his anointed, to David and to his descendants forevermore. When he wrote this, he must have been very aware of the promise that God made to him about his sons would rule on the throne of Israel for all time. But God, he just simply is saying here that God gives him, he's his king, and shows a mercy to David, who was the one that was anointed by Samuel, and David and his descendants forevermore. So this psalm, I think, gives us a good summary of David's feelings that are expressed in many of the psalms, and tell us something about his nature, that he's trying to be like God. God's merciful, so he's trying to be, and God, of course, has all these nations. His way is perfect, so he's trying to do that. The word of God is proven. So it's an interesting psalm, and I think it may be kind of like the core psalm of David's experience with God, or the core that he left with us. Now, let's talk about some of his characteristics. Number one is, of course, there are many, but physical courage. David, from day one, wasn't afraid of anything. He was a very courageous man. He delighted in, as he said to King Saul, in killing bears and wolves, and then killing them barehanded or hitting them with the rock or whatever it might be. He was certainly not one who was lacking in the let's just say the courage stage. I want to go back to 1 Samuel 16. He does say that courage, of course, came from God, not just from himself. It wasn't just his own courage. First, let's go to chapter 17. Just begin there, even though we need to go back to chapter 16 in a few minutes. In chapter 17 and verse 28, well, we're getting into something else here. So let's go back. I think we're going to need to go back here and get a little bit more background. 1 Samuel 17, let's begin in verse 11. I'm sorry, chapter 17. Let's start in chapter 17. We kind of read some of this last time. The Philistines were gathered in their armies. Saul and the men of Israel were gathered on one side of the valley, the Philistines on the other. And then they have Goliath here. Goliath was 6 cubits in a span, his height was, so he was a very tall man. The staff of his spear was like a weaver's beam. He stood and cried out to the armies of Israel and said, why have you come up to the line for battle? Am I not a Philistine? Choose you the servants of Saul, or choose a man for yourself. So he was taunting the Israelites for about 40 days. Verse 13, the 3 oldest sons of Jesse had gone to follow Saul to the battle. So the 3 older sons of Jesse were big, strong, good-looking men too, and they took their shields and their swords, whatever they had, and they then went off to be part of the Israelite army. The names of these 3 who went to battle were Eliab, who was the firstborn. Next to him was Abinadab, and the third was Shema. David was the youngest, and the 3 oldest followed Saul. But David occasionally went and returned to Saul to feed his father's sheep at Bethlehem. So he kind of tagged along, but he would go back to Bethlehem and then feed the sheep for a few days. Verse 16, the Philistine drew near and presented himself 40 days, morning and evening. So the time went on, it drug on. The soldiers didn't have a lot of extra food. They had to have food brought to them on a regular basis. So verse 17, Jesse said to his son David, take for your brothers an ephah of grain and 10 loaves, and run to your brothers at camp and carry 10 cheeses to the captain of the thousands and see how your brothers fare. So Jesse wanted to give some food also to the commander, probably let him know that they were, supporting him, whatever, and giving him some food. So verse 20, David rose early in the morning, left his sheep with the keeper, and took the things and went as Jesse had commanded him. So he did what his father said. He was going to the camp as an army was going out to fight and shouting for battle. For Israel and Philistines had drawn up in battle array, army against army. So David didn't just wait around to feed his brothers. It says he left his supplies in the hand of the supply keeper and ran to the army and came and greeted his brothers. And as he talked with them, there was a champion, this Philistine of Gath, Goliath by name, coming up from the armies of the Philistines and spoke according to the same words. So David heard them. So all the men of Israel, when they saw the man, fled from him, and they were dreadfully afraid. So the men of Israel said, have you seen this man who has come up? Surely he has come to defy Israel. It shall be that the man who kills him, the king will enrich with great riches, and will give him his daughter, and give his father's house exemption from taxes in Israel. So David spoke to the men who stood by, saying, what shall be done for the man who kills this Philistine and takes away the reproach from him? He says, is this really true? They're going to do all these things because a person kills one other person. It says, for who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God? So he begins by observing that this Philistine is defying God, not defying men. He's defying the armies of the living God. And the manner answered him in this manner, saying, so shall it be done for the man who kills him. Now, the next little kind of tidbit in the story here is about a very jealous older brother. Now, Eliab was the oldest brother. And of course, one chapter earlier, chapter 16, David is anointed. We'll go look at that in a minute. It doesn't say what Eliab thought when his baby brother, the youngest of the entire group, is anointed by Samuel. And Samuel does not say you are anointed to be king over Israel. In fact, we look at the chapter, we find that Samuel didn't say anything. It was kind of left to the family to decide, what does this anointing mean? And probably what they thought was he was anointing him to be, David to be the successor to Samuel, to be the next prophet for Israel. So they may have thought, well, it's kind of like Elijah and Elisha and the other prophets who were choosing their successor. We really don't know. But Eliab, his oldest brother, he was jealous. When he spoke to the men, and Eliab's anger was aroused against David and said, why did you come down here? And with whom have you left those few sheep in the wilderness? I know your pride and the insolence of your heart, for you have come down to see the battle. So the older brother is like people that are always in the lives of other people. They're telling you can't do it. They try to impugn your motives. They criticize what you want to do or why. A couple of years ago at camp, in my sermon for all the campers, we talked quite a bit about Eliab, that there will be an Eliab in everyone's life. Tell him you can't make it. Tell him you can't do this, or tell him that your motives are wrong, which is what Satan, of course, wants all of us to think about making it into God's kingdom. And so Eliab here was an example of people that are still around, a human attitude that is still around, jealousy, envy, and we have to learn to rely on God's promises and ignore the voice of the Eliabs in our life. So he says, verse 20, David said, what have I done now? Is there not a cause? He says, I've done nothing wrong. You can't find a cause of something I've done. And he turned from him toward another and said the same thing. And these people answered him as the first ones did. So they all said, he's too small. They all said, who do you think you are, saying that this Goliath shouldn't be out there, confronting the armies of God. When the words which David spoke were heard, they reported them to Saul, and he sent for him. And David said to Saul, let no man's heart fail because of him. Your servant will go and fight with this Philistine. So David was not a 10-year-old boy. He was a full-grown man, very likely 17, maybe 18 years old. He reached his height. He reached his muscular, prowess, you might say. So he was not a small little guy. I've seen a movie or two where they portray this. It's like a 12-year-old kid running out there. And of course, that's not the case. As often Hollywood is, movie makers portray things incorrectly. And David said to Saul, let no man's heart fail because of him. Your servant will go and fight with this Philistine. Saul said to David, "You are not able to go against the Philistine to fight. He's been a fighter since he was your age, and you're now, much younger than him." But David said to Saul, "Your servant used to keep his father's sheep, and when a lion or bear came and took a lamb out of the flock, I went out after it and struck it and delivered the lamb from its mouth." So I'm not sure what kind of bears and lions roamed the land in ancient Israel. There obviously were many, because they're mentioned a number of times in scriptures. There are pictographs of them or portrayals of them in a few places there. But if he could go out and take a lamb out of the mouth of a lion or a bear, he must have taken some serious prowess. Having seen a few great big bears in Alaska, let's just say that I was never inclined to go over and take something out of one of their mouths, whether it was fish or just whatever. But the ones we saw were very large, and if they wanted to have a fish, they took it. And they did take several that were on the lines of people we would know were fishing. In fact, I think they took one from my daughter Bridget one time. But at any rate, the important thing here is how courageous David was. And he did it because God gave him the strength. No doubt when he killed the lion and the lamb, the lion and the bear took the lamb away and saved it, he would have prayed for God's help first, said, "God, please give me strength," whatever. Verse 36, "Your servant has killed both lion and bear, and this uncircumcised Philistine will be like one of them." It could be that he used his sling against the bear and the lion. Maybe he whacked them in the head and knocked them out too. Moreover, David said, "The Lord who delivered me from the paw of the lion and the paw of the bear, he will deliver me from the hand of the Philistine." So he had learned to be courageous because God would deliver him, and God was the one who was wanting him to be successful and on his side. So Saul said, "Go, and the Lord be with you." You can imagine him kind of rolling his eyes and saying, "Well, go ahead and try." So Saul clothed David with his armor, and he put a bronze helmet on his head. He also clothed him with a coat of mail. And David fastened his sword to his armor and tried to walk, for he had not tested them. And David said to Saul, "I cannot walk with these, for I have not tested them." He didn't say they were too big. He said they were simply, he wasn't used to them. He had never worn any kind of armor. And David said, I can't walk with them. So he took his staff in his hand. He chose for himself 5 smooth stones. That's because Goliath had 4 brothers, and he knew he may have to kill them all. Because at that time, avenging the death of a father or brother was a family tradition. They had to in turn try to kill the person who killed their family member. And he drew near to the Philistine. So the Philistine came and began drawing near to David, and the man who bore the shield went before him. So if Goliath had a shield bearer. And when the Philistine looked and saw David, he disdained him, for he was only a youth, ready and good looking. So the Philistine said, "Am I a dog that you come to me with sticks?" David had a staff, a shepherd's staff. And the Philistine cursed David by his gods. And the Philistine said to David, "Come, I will give your flesh to the birds of the air and the beasts of the field." David said to the Philistine, "You come to me with a sword, with a spear, and with a javelin, but I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied." So he came not saying he was strong and he was going to win the battle, but that God, the Lord of hosts, the God of Israel, would win the battle. And this is a theme that really goes throughout all of David's life. He understood that, and that may be one of the great qualities that enables him to be chosen by God to lead in the world tomorrow. "This day the Lord will deliver you into my hand. I will strike you and take your head from you. And this day I will give the carcasses of the camp of the Philistines to the birds of the air and the wild beasts of the earth." Notice that all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel. That's exactly what happened. He apparently knocked out the Goliath by hitting him in the head with a stone. And while Goliath was laying there kind of in a daze or unconscious on the ground, he got out his sword and chopped off his head, because it said he killed him with the sword. It doesn't say he killed him with the rock. So David ran and got his sword and cut his head off. And of course, then, much of the story beyond that. But while we're here, let's go back to 1 Samuel 16. We do want to look at the time when Samuel comes and anoints David as king, because what's interesting here is, well, several things, but one is that David is a keeper of sheep, and that he has been one who protected the sheep of his father's flock. There's some pretty interesting parallels, because the sheep of God's flock are his people, his followers, and they need a protector, they need a shepherd. Just the story of shepherds in all of the stories in the accounts in Jeremiah and Ezekiel are very clear that God will someday give perfect shepherds, give very solid shepherds to the people of Israel, replace the ones who have caused them to go astray, which they have as a nation. Let's look over here in chapter 16, 1 Samuel chapter 16. And let's go back to verse 1. The Lord said to Samuel, how long will you mourn for Saul, seeing I have rejected him? So when God told Samuel that Saul was rejected from being king, Samuel mourned. Samuel personally mourned over it for a long time. I'm sending you to Jesse the Bethlehemite, for I have provided myself a king among his sons. Now, it doesn't say his firstborn son. It says among his sons is what God told him. So, of course, Jesse had to go to a sacrifice. Verse 6, so it was when they came, because the sons of Jesse were to come as their father called them. So the first one came was Eliab. We've already mentioned Eliab was jealous of David, was critical of him, impugned his motives, kind of ragged on him apparently quite a bit. And Eliab came to him, and Samuel said, surely the Lord's anointed is before him. Because Eliab was, good looking, probably tall, probably, looked like, boy, this is it. The Lord said to Samuel, do not look at his appearance or at his physical stature, because I have refused him. For the Lord does not see as man sees, for the Lord looks on the man looks on the outward appearance, but the Lord looks on the heart. And that's very, very important principle. And for a lot of us to think about and pause about, God wants people who are beautiful on the inside. He wants people who are beautiful. It's nice to have an outward appearance and keep in shape and healthy and all that type of thing. But God is very concerned about being beautiful on the inside, not just our looks on the outside. Well, God said no. And so verse 8, Jesse called Ahithophel, who was second. God said no. Jesse called Shammah, who was third. And he said no. And thus made 7 of his sons pass before Samuel. And the Lord said, I've not chosen these. And Samuel said, well, don't you have another son? I mean, God has rejected all of these. He said, there remains the youngest, but there he is keeping the sheep. And Samuel said to Jesse, send and bring him. We will not sit down till he comes. So he came, verse 12, he was ready with bright eyes, good looking. And the Lord said, arise, anoint him, for this is the one. As I mentioned before, 13, Samuel doesn't announce, at least there's no record of him announcing what this anointing is for. He's not saying this is the new king to replace King Saul. Of course, if David was about 17, which he apparently was, 17 to 18, it would have been 12 to 13, at least 13 years between this anointing and when he actually became king at the death of Saul. So it was going to be a long time coming. He's been anointed to be king, but it's going to be a long delay and a lot of trials and a lot of problems, a lot of challenges, a lot of major decisions and character to be tested times in the meantime. It's very similar to when God calls Christians today. We are anointed with God's Holy Spirit at baptism and the receiving of his Spirit, but we are not kings yet. It's sometimes years and years and years and years. And we have a lot of very, very fine memories of God's saints who were very dedicated to his truth and his way of life, who are now waiting in their graves. We've had, by my count, five people in our congregation die since the COVID restrictions were put in place. And so we've got, more and more of them are being added to those saints who obtained a good report, as it says at the end of Hebrews, and are now awaiting to receive their reward at the same time as the rest of us. Let's look at it here. God says here that the account here in verse 13, Samuel took the horn of oil and anointed him in the midst of his brothers. And the Spirit of the Lord came upon David from that day forward. So Samuel arose and went to Ramah. Now, I wish we had more details in this chapter. What does it mean the Spirit of God came upon David? Maybe there was nothing outwardly that we could say, oh, the Spirit of God is doing that to him. He's not prophesying. He's not singing religious songs. He's not speaking in other languages. Doesn't say anything. It just says from that day forward, God's Spirit was with him. And I think that's what it means. No supernatural apparitions, no supernatural indications of any kind. And just from that day forward, the Spirit of God came upon David. And David then, God was with David. So this we have a little bit of that then as a background to chapter 17. And of course, we have David killing Goliath. The next thing I want to talk about was David's prudence, the fact that he had a lot of self-control, he had a lot of wisdom and maturity for his age. For a young man his age, just a lot of good things are said about him. In chapter 16 and verse 18, it says, one of the servants answered and said, Jesse, I have seen a son of Jesse in Bethlehem, who is, notice what this young man tells Saul about David, just really right after David is anointed king and then goes back out to herd sheep. He's anointed, he goes back out to herd sheep. He says, look, I have seen a son of Jesse in Bethlehem, who was, number one, skillful in playing. So he was a musician, skillful in playing. Now, what he played is obviously a conjecture of guesses. There is a picture of the harp of David in the flag of Ulster, Northern Ireland, and a number of Irish flags have this kind of a U-shaped harp of David with a bar across the top and about 6 different strings. There are others that say it may have been one string with a long bunch of frets on a neck. Who knows? Maybe it was 3 or 4 strings. But at any rate, David was well known to play it well and to sing. So he was a musician. He is a mighty man of valor. So it was known that he was courageous. It was known that he killed bears and lions, protected his sheep. He was a man of valor, a man of war. I don't know what that means. And I hadn't gone to war before. And maybe it meant that he was a man who believed that God would protect them in war, or was a man, obviously, who would be a good warrior someday. Prudent in speech. Now, if there's one thing that all of us would like to be, it's prudent in speech. You know, there's the old saying that you don't get in trouble for what you don't say. It's not entirely true, but it is a pretty good maxim. That saying the wrong thing at the wrong time and then wishing you could just reach out and grab the words and bring them back is a very common experience. Or after a conversation with someone, you think of later what you should have said and you rehearse it in your mind and go through all of those things. But David is here known as being prudent in speech, and he's only 17 or 18. He's pretty young. Shows that he matured early. He grew up and he was able to think. He studied a lot of the commandments of God. He must have had an excellent ability to read and to write. He may have had some of his own copies of the scrolls. It does seem he had at least all the books of Moses and perhaps a couple of historical books. We don't know. But at any rate, he was here called a man who was prudent in speech, a handsome person, and the Lord is with him. So it was even known in his area, because this person that tells him about it, just one of the servants answered, well, I know of this person, Jesse, a Bethlehemite. This is before, of course, the account of killing Goliath. So David is known here for being prudent in speech, but actually several places this is mentioned. Let's go to 1 Samuel chapter 18 and verse 5. 1 Samuel chapter 18 and verse 5. So David went out wherever Saul went, wherever Saul sent him. So remember, David became a part of Saul's court, and he played the instrument for him when God allowed this demon to torment him. So David went out wherever Saul sent him, and he behaved wisely. So even as a youth, 18, 19 years old, in the court of King Saul, that David went out wherever he was sent, and he behaved himself wisely. So much so that Saul set him over the men of war. He became the number one general of an army maybe of 60 to 75, 80,000. We don't know exact numbers, but the Bible does give us some hints that the armies of Israel were considerable in size. So he was a general over all of the army. He was accepted in the sight of all the people and also in the sight of the servants. I'm sorry about that. I should have turned that off, I guess. So at any rate, we have here a kind of a strong message or strong indication that he had behaved himself wisely. It was noticed by the people of the land. It was noticed by the people in the court of King Saul and by Saul himself. So it happened as they were coming home when David was returning from the slaughter of the Philistine, that the women had come out of the cities of Israel singing and dancing, and to meet King Saul with tambourines and joy and with musical instruments. But the women sang as they danced that David is saying 10,000, Saul only 1,000. So that made Saul, of course, very, very jealous. So we talked about that last time. David, of course, didn't say much. But David tried to avoid the evil or avoid the anger of Saul Verse 14, David behaved wisely in all his ways, and the Lord was with him. So chapter 18 and verse 14, what a great example for young adults, for teenagers, for young people today, is in this case, young David. He behaved wisely in all his ways, and the Lord was with him. Therefore, when Saul saw that he behaved very wisely, he was afraid of him. But all Israel and Judah loved David because he went out and came in before them. So then we have kind of some interesting next developments here. Saul said to David, "Here's my oldest daughter, Merab. I will give to her as a wife. Only be valiant for me and fight the Lord's battles." For Saul thought, "Let my hand not be against him, but let him have die at the hand of the Philistines." So David went out and led the army, and he came back then, assuming that Merab, the oldest daughter of Saul, would be given to him as his wife. But verse 19, it happened at the time when Merab, Saul's daughter, should have been given to David, that she was given to Adriel, the Meholatite, to wife. So David got betrayed. And this is one of a number of betrayals that we have recorded. And yet in every one of them, pretty much, there's a couple that he got kind of angry, but pretty much in every one of them, he had ultimate self-control. He didn't say what he could have said. He didn't accuse, even though he could have accused. He simply bite his tongue and said, well, God has a plan he's working out here, so we're going to simply let it go. Verse 20, now Michal, Saul's daughter, loved David. And they told Saul, and the thing pleased him. So as they were, living in the living in the palace. It wasn't a temple then. And, David spent some time, and all of a sudden the youngest daughter, sees David, and she falls in love with him. So Saul said, I will give her to him that she may be a snare to me. So, of course, Saul then had him go out and kill 100 Philistines and bring their body parts in. And this time he gave him, verse 27, Saul gave him Michal, his daughter, as wife. Saul saw and knew that the Lord was with David, and that Michal, Saul's daughter, loved him. Now, the story of Michal and David is not a good one. Wish it were better, but it's not. Michal was, apparently they had a fairly, happy romantic honeymoon period, so to speak. But then when David went out to battle again, then somehow King Saul was able as king to take his daughter, who is now David's wife, but somehow cause an annulment or divorce or decree or something. And then he gave her to one of his friends, another Benjaminite, to marry. So it was a very sad thing. And then David eventually had her brought back to him, but then she became kind of insolent against him. You remember the story. And so she then lived the rest of her life without children, which probably meant that she lived pretty much alone. So here, David's prudence, his foresight and understanding of wisdom and how things should be was a very, very important aspect of his life. I want to kind of leapfrog here over to chapter 30. I think we have time for that this evening. 1 Samuel chapter 30. In this case, we have David's wisdom in action. In this case, we're jumping over to a place where he had been up at Achish with 600 of his men, but it became a little bit untenuous, not good. So he was able to go down to a city called Ziklag that was given to him and to his men as a place of refuge, a place to live and be protected. Chapter 30, verse 1, it happened when David and his men came to Ziklag on the third day. There was a 3-day trip from where they were up at Achish. The Amalekites had invaded the south and attacked Ziklag and burned it with fire, and had taken captive the women who were there, small and great. They did not kill anyone, but carried them away, and they went their way. So the women and the possessions of David and his men were in Ziklag at the time, and they were carried away by the Amalekites who attacked the city while they were gone, because David had gone out to fight to protect some people in Israel and to help the Philistines at that point. We're kind of breaking into the story here. David and his men came to the city. You can imagine them walking into a city. It's burned with fire. Their wives, their sons, their daughters have been taken captive. So all of their families are taken captive as prisoners of these vile people known as Amalekites. Then David and the people who were with him lifted up their voices and wept until they had no more power to weep. Another indication of David's emotions, his love for his wife and his children. David's two wives, Ahinoam the Jezreelitess and Abigail, the widow of Nabal the Carmelite, had been taken captive. Now, I prepared something we'll look at a little bit later, but it's one of these confusing things. It's nice to make a chart maybe to make things a little easier to understand. This chart is called David's wives. It's a list, and it's a list of the ones we know of because some are simply not named. But the first one that he married was Michal, the second daughter of King Saul, and she was taken from him and given to somebody else. A terrible insult. This is the second insult or betrayal from King Saul to David concerning a wife. And then Abigail, who was the widow, the widow of Nabal, who God killed through a stroke or a heart attack. And then she was his next wife after that. She was the widow of Nabal, and she was the mother of Chileab. So we do have the names of most of the mothers of the sons of David. But right on the heels of that, he marries Ahinoam of Jezreel, Jezreel being up to the north. And Ahinoam and Abigail were the two wives that were taken captive, were kidnapped, taken by the Amalekites. Now, Ahinoam was later the mother of Ammon, and Ammon was the one who raped his sister and then was killed by this conspiracy led by his brother Absalom. Let's continue in the story here now. This is chapter 30 still. So David's two wives, Ahinoam the Jezreelitess and Abigail, the widow of Nabal the Carmelite, had been taken captive. Now David was greatly distressed. It says he cried until he had no more power to cry or weep. He was greatly distressed, for the people spoke of stoning him, for the soul of the people was grieved. But David strengthened himself in the Lord his God. The last part of verse 6 may be something we all have to experience when we have a time of weakness and feel like the world is lost. David strengthened himself in the Lord his God. David said to Abiathar the priest, Ahimelech's son, please bring the ephod here to me. And Abiathar brought the ephod to David. So the ephod was this pouch that the high priest would wear, and the lights would have the yes and no, and then of course the 12 stones of Israel, and they also had the pouch in which were the Urim and Thummim when they would ask God for an answer, and if their attitude was right, then he would give them an answer. So David began to ask, number one, shall I pursue the troop? Verse 8, shall I overtake them? And he answered him, pursue, for you shall surely overtake them, and without fail recover all. In other words, nobody's dead. All of your relatives, your wives, and children are alive. You'll recover them all. So David went, he and the 600 men who were with him, and came to the brook Besor, where those who stayed were left behind. So there were some of the men who were tired, weak, probably malnourished or underfed, and 200 stayed behind and protected the baggage or the food provisions that they had. Verse 11, they found an Egyptian in the field. He told them where they were, and of course, he led them to them. And the bottom line is, David attacked verse 17, and the only ones that escaped were 400 who escaped on camels. Verse 18, David recovered all the Amalekites had carried away. David rescued his two wives, and nothing of theirs was lacking, either great or small, sons or daughters. And David recovered them all. Now, the next part of this account gives us a little indication as to what kind of ruler David is going to be in the millennium, and maybe why God chose him. Because the wisdom that is shown in these next 15 verses is truly something that rulers should emulate. David came to the 200 men who had been so weary they could not follow David. And they had also made to stay at the brook Besor. So they didn't take part in the battle. 200 men stayed behind. 400 went with David and did the actual fighting. So they went out to meet him and the people who were with him. And when David came near the people, he greeted them. Then all the wicked and worthless men of those who went with David answered and said, so they were men who had gone out and done the fighting, and they were upset that David was considering giving a share of the spoils to the 200 men that stayed behind. Because they did not go with us, we will not give them any of the spoil that we have recovered, except for every man's wife and children, that they may lead them away and depart. So he's saying these men need to lead us or leave us. You know what? Just give them their children, let them go off. We're not going to give them any of the goods that we have recovered. And David said he understood these people were angry, and he understood he had to make a leader's decision here to keep his soldiers and his army together. David said, "You shall not do so with what the Lord has given us." In other words, God gave us victory. It is not our responsibility to keep what God has given to us and to not share. It says, it's kind of an important principle anyway. "My brethren, you shall not do so with what the Lord has given us, who has preserved us and delivered into our hand the troop that came to us." So he said, God gave us a victory. We didn't have to have extra men, and all that we had was spared because of God's mercy. Verse 24, "For who will heed you in this matter? But as his part is who goes down to the battle, so shall his part be who stays by the supplies. They shall share alike." So David overruled these angry men and said, no, everyone gets an equal share of the spoil. These men stayed here and protected the baggage, our possessions, our food. Verse 25, "So it was from that day forward, he made a statute and an ordinance for Israel to this day." So this law, this example of what David did here was eternal as far as the Israelites were concerned, that all would share equally, all who were in the battle and all who were, you might say, support staff behind the battle would all share equally in the spoils that came from the battle, the victory. So David came to Ziklag, where he sent some of the spoil to the elders of Judah, to his friends, saying, "Here is a present for you from the spoil of the enemies of the Lord." So of the possessions of the Amalekites and these others who had invaded and kidnapped, David didn't keep it. He sent it to the leading cities of Judah. Remember, he's south of Jerusalem and going into the wilderness and En-Gedi down towards Masada and all that. And so as he was running from Saul, but here he understands enough to make friends of those kings, of those leaders of the small towns of Judah all throughout the south. "Here is a present from you from the spoil of the enemies of the Lord." He did not have to do this, but it shows the wisdom that David had. "To those who were in Bethel, to those who were in Ramoth of the south, those who were in Jattar, to those who were in Arar, those who were in Simoth, those who were in Eshtemoa, those who were in Rakal, and those who were in the cities of the Jaharameelites, those who were in the cities of the Kenites, those who were in Hormah, those who were in Kordemesh, and those who were in Athan, those who were in Hebron, and all the places where David himself and his men were accustomed to rove." So he probably thought, we've been walking through their land, we've been camping on their territory, we've been eating some of their produce, and so I am now going to making sure that everybody has a share of the spoils of what God gave to us. So it does show his wisdom, and it does show you that this is the kind of wisdom that God expects and wants David to have in the millennium, and hopefully he wants all of us to have as we begin to think about the world tomorrow instead of the world today and society we live in. We must remember, as we read the story of David, David also lived among persons hardly of anyone he could trust. His family turned against him. Joab accused Abner of deceit, while he himself was faithful to almost no one except perhaps David. Ziba accused Meribal, or Jonathan's brother, of treachery, and others accused Ziba of falsehood. Oftentimes, David cannot tell who is speaking the truth. David is outwitted by Joab. He's actually sort of betrayed by Joab. The wonder, therefore, is that David, who was, it says here, guilty of an occasional obliquity, in other words, that he did things on a spur of the moment, kind of on a, you might say, impulse. He remained as straightforward and simple as he was. So he was able to keep a very straightforward and God-centered approach to life, and certainly wanted to see that God's power was behind everything he was doing, or God's blessing was behind what he was doing. And thankfully, he always gave God the credit. He didn't take the credit for himself. Now, I see our time is about up for Bible study. Next time, we're going to talk about David's family, and we will talk about these wives of David. As we look at David's life and the chaos that became his sons, and really there wasn't a lot of peace until Solomon was crowned, and even then it was 20 years of peace. After that, it was kind of a long history of some problems. But in David's own life itself, with all of his 16 sons that we know of, and living in a various number of places and having a whole bunch of different wives or mothers of them, it really is no surprise that the family was a dysfunctional family in many ways. It's kind of a sad account, but because of David's sin, then later with Bathsheba, God said the sword would never depart from his family. And we find that even today, that there are certainly some of those still challenges with the people who are sitting on the throne of David today. So next time we'll begin with David's family and some of the lessons we can learn from that. So with that, we'll say good night and hope everyone has a nice Sabbath coming up. We'll be meeting only in the Dalles with a limit of 25 people. Everybody else will need to be home watching at 11 a.m. And I certainly hope that that we can get back together and having church as normal as possible with everyone together in one place as soon as God allows that. We're certainly praying for that end. So good night. We'll see everyone in a week or two.